The campaign of 1806, which centred around the twin battles of Jena and Auerstadt, was one of Napoleon's most successful, for within 7 weeks his army had inflicted around 25,000 casualties and captured over 140,000 Prussian soldiers. However, the campaign was not flawless, and the 2 battles mentioned above were marred with an incident which very nearly ended with one of the French corps commanders, Marshal Bernadotte, being sent before a military tribunal, the consequences of which may very well have ended with his execution. Much has been written about this incident and the characters involved, and although Bernadotte consistently proclaimed his innocence, believing himself to have only been following orders, many of his contemporaries and most subsequent historians have condemned his actions and accused him of serious disobedience, the result of which saw Marshal Davout's Third Corps face the brunt of the Prussian army entirely alone. However, was this really the case? If Bernadotte did purposefully disobey orders, as is claimed, then why did he insist that he was merely following them? And if he was in the wrong, then what were his reasons for doing so? Was it simply a personal feud with Davout? Then finally, once blame had been assigned and the orders for Bernadotte's court-martial supposedly written, why did Napoleon ultimately tear them up and refuse to go through with them? In the following video, we will follow the evidence and attempt to answer these questions. But first, we must examine the events and actions as they unfolded before we can dive into any analysis. By the beginning of October 1806, France and Prussia were once more at war, and although the Prussian armies made the first moves by crossing the Elbe River, Napoleon set out to reclaim the initiative, launching his main offensive through the Franconian forest in an effort to turn the Prussians and threaten both their supply lines and their major cities. The Emperor had split his army into 3 columns in order to traverse the forest, and leading the central column was Marshal Bernadotte, the commander of First Corps, whilst Marshal Davout's Third Corps followed behind. Being in the centre also meant that Bernadotte was instructed to act as the vanguard of the army, pushing about half a day's march further ahead of the other corps, with the aim of both forcing the enemy back as well as gathering information regarding their whereabouts. With light cavalry being essential for the latter of these roles, joining Bernadotte in the vanguard was Marshal Murat, along with the light cavalry elements of the reserve cavalry. Murat, being both a brilliant cavalryman and somewhat single-minded, was frequently utilised by Napoleon as the commander of his vanguard, and although mistakes were often made, generally the results were favourable. Therefore, at this point in the campaign, Bernadotte's First Corps was seen as being there to provide Murat's cavalry with mainly infantry and artillery support, and so Bernadotte was very much viewed as being under the command of Murat, as Vacher explains. In this first part of the campaign, the First Corps was to a certain extent placed under the orders of Murat, the Emperor's Lieutenant General. This hierarchy of command is important to recognise and will become clear when we examine the orders sent from Napoleon shortly. Unsurprisingly, it was this combined vanguard that met the first elements of Prussian resistance near the town of Schliess on Thursday the 9th of October, where they drove back a small force and captured many prisoners. It was an early sign of French success, though at this point Napoleon was still unsure as to the exact location and intentions of the main Prussian armies. Although he did have some indications that there was a Prussian force west of the River Saale, close to Erfurt, Napoleon's initial expectations were that the Prussians would attempt to concentrate their forces around Gera, and thus attempt to block his passage north, but events and information gathered over the next few days would quickly prove this assumption wrong. However, in working from this presumption, the Grand Army continued its thrust north, and by Saturday the 11th of October, the vanguard of Bernadotte and Murat had reached the town of Gera, where they found very little resistance and every indication that the enemy was retreating westwards in the direction of Jena. In fact, General Lasalle's interception of a convoy and subsequent interrogation of the prisoners revealed that the concentration of the Prussian army was actually taking place at Erfurt. This news, received late on Saturday night, prompted Napoleon to rethink his operations, the result of which became the set of orders dated 4 AM Sunday 12th of October, detailing a change of front from north to west of the entire army, a brilliant manoeuvre made possible by the corps system and something which I examined in a previous video. However, it is to this set of orders and the subsequent manoeuvre where we must now begin to examine events in detail, as it is here where the controversy begins. The orders which saw La Grande Armée rotate from north to west also saw a restructuring of the formation in which it had to this point been marching. Bernadotte's role within this structure was therefore about to change. Bernadotte's First Corps now became not the spearhead of an advancing central column, but the right flank of an enveloping crescent. To understand how this came to happen, we can first look at the orders that Bernadotte received from Imperial headquarters, and although signed by Marshal Berthier, who was the Chief of Staff of the army, these orders were always formed from directives dictated by Napoleon. However, here is Bernadotte's orders, dated 4 AM on Sunday the 12th of October. I beg to inform you, Monsieur le Maréchal, that I am sending an order to the Grand Duke of Berg to proceed to Zeitz, and thence to Naumburg, if the information which he gathers concerning the enemy still leads him to believe that its principal forces are near Erfurt. The Emperor's intention is that you should support the Grand Duke's movement. Arrange with him regarding your march. Headquarters will be transferred today at noon to Gera. As mentioned, and as these orders make clear, Bernadotte was supporting Murat's movement, and therefore it would be prudent to see what Napoleon had in mind for the commander of his vanguard. The Emperor orders, mon prince, that you leave Gera immediately for Zeitz and send out skirmishers in the direction of Leipzig. It is the Emperor's wish that from Zeitz, if the information you receive shows that the enemy is still near Erfurt, you should proceed to Naumburg, where Marshal Davout will be. Headquarters will today be at Gera. The position of the army today, the 12th, is as follows: Marshal Soult at Gera, Marshal Ney at Mittel, Marshal Lannes at Jena, Marshal Augereau at Calle, and Marshal Davout en route from Mittel to Naumburg. By these orders then, Napoleon directed both Murat and Bernadotte not straight upon Naumburg, but firstly upon Zeitz, in order to scout the plains between that place and Leipzig. The reasoning behind this was that, although Napoleon was committed to turning his entire army to face what he supposed to be the real location of the Prussian forces, he also wanted to ensure that there were no strong forces to his north that could threaten the flank of La Grande Armée as it made this manoeuvre. If no substantial force was encountered during this reconnaissance, then Murat and Bernadotte were to move and take up position behind Davout's Third Corps at Naumburg. Therefore, upon receipt of these orders, Murat's cavalry raced to Zeitz, from where he spread his cavalry patrols out towards Leipzig, with Bernadotte's corps following close behind, ready to offer support if necessary. However, after encountering nothing except more proof that the Prussians were mostly to the west, Murat withdrew his cavalry and alongside Bernadotte began to carry out the second part of their orders by marching towards Davout at Naumburg, resting for the night at Minway, about halfway along this journey. Napoleon received the corps reports late on Sunday evening, and from their contents he began to plan for an advance west in order to engage the Prussians in a decisive battle, which in the Emperor's mind would take place near Erfurt and towards the end of the week, most likely on Thursday. As you can see, with this new plan, Bernadotte's First Corps was no longer part of the vanguard, but had been shifted to the second line, behind Davout's corps as part of this new right wing of the army. As if to confirm this role switch, in the early morning of Monday the 13th, Murat was ordered to leave Bernadotte and bring his cavalry to Jena, as to take his place once more in the vanguard, this time to be supported by Marshal Lannes' 5th Corps. However, events on this Monday were to immediately throw all of Napoleon's plans and presumptions up into the air, and force him to once again react to a new situation, for the battle that he longed for was much closer than he thought. During Sunday night, because Napoleon still believed that a battle would not take place until Thursday, he felt that Monday should be spent in closing up his formations, giving rest to those already in position, and generally resupplying the men, all in preparation for the advance which would begin on Tuesday. Therefore, the orders and letters composed during the early hours of the 13th merely ordered the corps to do just this. Despite a set of fresh orders being written out, neither Bernadotte nor his First Corps received any form of communication from either Napoleon or General Headquarters. Whilst this obviously isn't the best practice, it wasn't as bad as it initially seems, for two reasons. The first being that, with Napoleon planning on closing up his formations, and because Bernadotte had yet to reach Naumburg, then his orders from the previous day were still relevant, and were in fact what he followed. The second reason was that Napoleon, as mentioned, did write to Marshal Murat, who was still at this point marching with, and in many ways in command of, Bernadotte, who would therefore have been privy to the contents of the following letter. You have received orders from the staff to make no movement today in order to give the troops a little rest. If the Prince of Württemberg came to Leipzig, it would be a good opportunity to give him a licking. I know his position exactly. He has not more than 10,000 men. I have no news either from Jena or Naumburg. I shall doubtless receive some in an hour. Let your dragoons rest so that, according to the order I shall give tonight, they will reach Jena tomorrow. My intention is to march straight on the enemy. Send a commissary of war to Leipzig with an order to prepare there 30,000 rations of bread and to send them to Naumburg. I shall leave here at 9 in the morning in order to be at Jena at noon or 1 o'clock. If the enemy is at Erfurt, my plan is to direct my army on Weimar and attack it on the 16th. The first thing to note about this letter is that it references the resting of the troops as well as the gathering of supplies, which as stated was Napoleon's plan for the day, and is important to remember as it will potentially explain some of Bernadotte's actions later on. The second point of note concerns the opening line, which makes reference to a set of orders being sent out in addition to this letter. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to locate these orders, but Napoleon does say that they contained instructions to make no movement today, which is probably because he expected Murat, and by association Bernadotte, to have already arrived at Naumburg as of their orders from the previous day. However, as we know, they had halted and bivouacked on the road, and this letter would coincidentally arrive around midday, just as the two marshals were entering Naumburg. Lastly, the final line continues to confirm Napoleon's belief that a major battle wouldn't take place until the 16th, which would have been on the Thursday. This letter is dated at 7 AM on Monday, but within 2 hours everything was about to change. After seeing the completion of these letters and orders, the Emperor impatiently waited for the information that he mentioned to Murat that he was missing, namely from Naumburg and Jena, and between 8 and 9 AM these reports finally began to arrive. The report from Davout confirmed that the King of Prussia had been at Weimar, as well as the fact that there were no enemy troops around Naumburg nor towards Leipzig. As for Jena, although Napoleon still desired news from Marshal Lannes, whose corps was supposed to have occupied the town, the report from Marshal Augereau, whose corps was following that of Lannes, alluded to the fact that Jena was abandoned by the enemy, who were now said to be falling back upon Weimar. In addition, a report from Murat arrived telling of an informant who, having recently travelled from Fulda to Naumburg and having passed through Erfurt, had spied Prussian troops all along that route. This report also mentioned that a Prussian bridging train had been spotted crossing the Saale at Wissenfels and was heading northwest. I have to be honest here in stating that I'm not entirely sure what exactly it was in these reports that convinced Napoleon to change his mind about the Prussian intentions, because it seems to me that about 90% of the above information simply confirmed what he already expected and was planning for. They confirmed that his north flank was safe and that the majority of the Prussians were located around Erfurt, which was the same conclusion that he held merely hours earlier, and therefore, at least to me, his own plan from that time of resting his men before then advancing on the morrow would still seem to be valid. However, at 9 AM, Napoleon dictated the following letter and order to Marshal Murat. At last the veil is drawn aside. The enemy is beginning to retreat on Magdeburg. Go as quickly as possible with Bernadotte's corps to Dornburg, a large village situated between Jena and Naumburg. Go there yourself with your dragoons and cavalry. I think that the enemy will either try to attack Marshal Lannes at Jena or will slip away. If they attack Marshal Lannes, your position at Dornburg will enable you to help him. If nothing new happens, come to me yourself tonight to Jena. Apparently something had changed Napoleon's thinking, for he now believed that the Prussians had no intention of offering him battle before Erfurt, and were instead beginning to retreat upon Magdeburg. Further to this, he also feared that Marshal Lannes might be attacked. Fouché attributes this to the receipt of Lannes' report, which indicated a large Prussian force encountered on the heights beyond Jena, but this report wouldn't reach Napoleon until 3 p.m, and so this fear cannot come from that source, nor can it be found in the other information he received, as the only mention of the enemy at Jena was that they were retreating. Therefore Napoleon's, as it turns out well-founded, fear that Lannes could be attacked came from somewhere different, just like his feeling that the Prussians were in fact retreating. The only new information I can see that hints at a retreat is the news of the bridging train moving northwest, but even that could have been doing so having become aware of the French advance upon Naumburg, and was therefore forced to take a longer route before rejoining the army towards Erfurt. It is a little frustrating that most sources here just seem to take it as a given that Napoleon had discovered some new insight that allowed him to understand the Prussians and changed his mind, but I just don't see it from the information we are given. I could be wrong, and perhaps I'm missing the obvious, or I've misunderstood something, but my own belief is that he could only have come to this change of mind because of one of two reasons. The first is that he was privy to information beyond these reports from his marshals, perhaps through spies or his own branch of reconnaissance. However, I'm not totally sold on this, as Napoleon still seemed very unsure as to the actual intentions of the Prussians, as he doesn't know if they will attack Lannes or not, and his army bulletin issued at 10 a.m. on the Monday still makes it clear that he doesn't expect a battle until later in the week. Plus, as we shall see, although he now correctly views the Prussians as retreating, he is wrong about the line and destination of this retreat. The other reason I think possible is simply that Napoleon, whilst waiting at his headquarters for the missing reports, would no doubt have been poring over his maps and perhaps came to the realization that the Prussians were unlikely to simply sit and wait for him to engage them at Erfurt. It was not possible to suppose that the Prussians meant to fight with their backs against the Harz mountains, hence the presumption was that they intended to fall back behind the Elbe. Maud makes a good point, and although the Prussians could theoretically also become the aggressors, by this point in the campaign the French had effectively turned their flank and were in position to threaten their communications with Berlin, and therefore the only sensible option available to them was to retreat, which they proceeded to do. However, Napoleon, when weighing up these Prussian options, may have also noticed that his own dispositions were at best careless and at worst vulnerable to an attack from the west. There were two weaknesses in his position. The first was that the gap between his right wing and centre was almost twice as large as that between his centre and his left wing, and his right could therefore be easily isolated and destroyed. The second was that his army currently had the Saale River passing almost directly between the first and second lines, and in particular Marshal Lannes, if attacked by a superior force at Jena, would find it difficult to either receive support or to extricate himself with a river at his back. Therefore, once Napoleon received confirmation that the Prussians were almost all to his west, he immediately wrote to Murat and ordered him to bring both his cavalry and Bernadotte's corps to Dornburg, a move which not only filled in the gap between his centre and right wing, but it also provided potential support for Marshal Lannes should he be attacked. Napoleon also ordered the reserve cavalry to move closer to Jena and for Soult to move one of his 3 divisions closer as well. However, at this point, none of the other corps were ordered forward nor alerted to any potential danger. This, as we shall see, came later when he received Lannes' report and his fear of being attacked was proven justified. This may seem like a large side tangent, something which is becoming a habit in my videos I fear, but I feel it is relevant to at least attempt to understand Napoleon's thinking in his placement of his troops and the orders given to the marshals. As we will see, almost all of Napoleon's calculations and estimations turn out to be wrong, and in ordering Murat and Bernadotte to Dornburg, at this point he was not foreseeing a major battle taking place the following day. It was a contingency measure taken, in my opinion, because he realised there was an error in his original dispositions and calculations, not necessarily because of new information. I also want to say that just because Napoleon was wrong about, well, a lot in this part of the campaign, it doesn't make him a poor commander or stupid. There is an unfortunate set of writers who either over-criticise or over-praise Napoleon. In their minds, he is either just extremely lucky or can simply do no wrong in his military affairs. As usual, neither of these views are helpful or accurate. He of course gets things wrong, for no matter how much thought goes into planning and predicting enemy movements, rarely does the enemy actually play the role assigned to them. Events always appear so simple when looking, with the benefit of hindsight, at maps with all of the positions and movements showing on them, but a commander is trying to piece together an understanding of enemy intentions based upon reports, rumours and reconnaissance. Essentially, as Wellington puts it, he is trying to guess what is on the other side of the hill, and given that he isn't psychic, he won't always guess correctly. The mark of a great commander is not just in this ability to predict the enemy, but it is also, and I would argue more so, in the ability to react and adjust to the truth of the situation as it becomes clear. Again, Wellington identifies this in his comment about Marshal Soult's ability as a commander. Unrivaled as a strategist, but timid in action. Essentially, Soult could plan a good battle, but once events didn't go to plan, usually because the enemy did something different than he had envisioned, he would be hesitant to react and alter what he deemed a well thought out strategy. But discussing Marshal Soult's capabilities as a commander is certainly a side tangent, and so we shall return to the narrative. Although dated at 9 AM, this letter ordering Murat and Bernadotte to fill the void in the French dispositions didn't arrive in Murat's hands until 3 PM, by which point he was settled in Naumburg. Once again, Marshal Bernadotte had received no direct communication, but he was mentioned specifically in this letter, and as he was at this point still under Murat's command, it is clear that he was meant to read and understand his directives, namely to march to Dornburg. Murat, however, chose to interpret these orders in his own fashion, and although the final line says that if nothing happens during the day that he is to report to Imperial headquarters, the impatient Marshal felt it imperative to go there as soon as possible. Murat therefore left Bernadotte in command of his cavalry with the understanding that he would take them, along with his own First Corps, to Dornburg, whilst Murat and a small escort set off immediately to join Napoleon. Bernadotte, now left to his own devices and with the burden of additional cavalry, instead of setting off immediately for Dornburg, chose to allow the stragglers of his corps to catch up and to give his troops some rest. Again, the reasons or justifications for this will be discussed later, but at 6 PM he penned the following letter to Imperial headquarters. Although my troops are very tired and have not had their meal, I shall start in half an hour and I shall reach Camberg before midnight. I shall then give my troops a short rest, and shall be at Dornburg before daylight tomorrow, ready to proceed to Weimar or anywhere else. My cavalry will be at Dornburg tonight. Had Bernadotte carried out these intentions, then there would have been no controversy, but fresh orders were about to be delivered, though again not for Bernadotte. As mentioned, Napoleon, along with sending out the order for Murat and Bernadotte to move, had also instructed Soult and the reserve cavalry to make movements towards Jena, but all of the troops were still working on the 7 AM orders which instructed a day of rest and resupply. However, at around 3 PM, when Napoleon was on his way to Jena, Marshal Lannes' report finally arrived and told of a strong Prussian force spotted on the height beyond Jena. Now, Napoleon's fears of an attack seemed perfectly justified, and his reaction was to immediately send fresh orders to Marshals Lefebvre, Soult, Ney, and Davout. The first three were ordered to move their troops immediately towards Jena, whilst Marshal Davout received the following instructions. The Emperor, Monsieur le Maréchal, learns 1 league from Jena that the enemy is face to face with Marshal Lannes with nearly 50,000 men. The Marshal even believes that he will be attacked this evening. If, this evening, you hear an attack at Jena, you must manoeuvre on the enemy and outflank its left. If there is no attack this evening at Jena, you will receive the dispositions for tomorrow. This letter reached the Marshal in the evening, and Davout, knowing that Bernadotte had only just left Naumburg, rode to show him the letter. Although, as you can see, these orders only make reference and give instruction to Davout and his Third Corps, Bernadotte, upon reading it, immediately orders his own troops to halt. Several historians suggest that Bernadotte's reasoning for doing this was that he had received his own orders at this time, but I can find no reference of such an order, and the opening line of the following letter which he then wrote to Berthier makes it fairly clear that he had only seen the orders brought by Davout. Marshal Davout has just communicated to me, Duke, your letter to him of today, of which your aide-de-camp, Monsieur Perigord was the bearer. In view of its contents, I thought it my duty to stop the contemplated movement of which I informed you in my letter of 6 p.m. this evening, because you order Marshal Davout to maneuver on the enemy's left wing in the event of Marshal Lannes being attacked tonight in the neighbourhood of Jena, and you add that if the attack does not take place, he will receive further orders from the Emperor tomorrow. As I presume that those will be general orders, I am halting my troops where they are, and I await further commands. I am still with my whole corps in the neighbourhood of Naumburg. I am ready to execute whatever orders the Emperor shall send me. Having only left Naumburg barely an hour earlier, Bernadotte's First Corps hadn't got far, and therefore spent the night camped on the southern road out of Naumburg, whilst Davout's corps was camped on the west road, with his most advanced division holding the crossings at Colson. The feared Prussian attack upon Lannes never materialised, and after inspecting both the ground and the enemy positions, Napoleon proceeded to misinterpret events once again, this time wrongly believing to have the majority of the Prussian army before him. Seeing a chance for the potentially decisive battle that he longed for, he dictated plans and dispositions for his own attack on the Tuesday morning. Lannes was to pin the enemy with support from Marshal Augereau, whilst Ney and Soult were to form the second line from where they could be utilised as necessary. It was then hoped that Bernadotte's First Corps, along with Murat's light cavalry, would debouch from Dornberg and fall upon the enemy's left flank. The role of Marshal Davout was outlined in the following order, the contents of which would form the basis of all the confusion and controversy surrounding the actions of Bernadotte the following day. Marshal Bernadotte has received orders to go to Dornberg. It is very important that he should have gone there. But if he should be at Naumburg, that would make it the more necessary for you to execute forthwith the following orders, namely to go to Apolda and to fall on the enemy's rear if they should be engaged with us, as we expect they will. You can take whatever route you find most convenient, but the important thing is that you should take part in the battle. If Marshal Bernadotte should be with you, you might march together, but the Emperor hopes that he will be in the position which he has indicated to him at Dornberg. Thus, Marshal Davout's Third Corps was to march to Apolda, and from there fall upon the rear of the Prussian army, cutting their retreat and ideally causing their annihilation. These orders also make clear reference to Bernadotte, but we shall discuss that in a moment, as it seems that Napoleon was about to have his decisive battle, and it is a credit to both himself and the French system that, despite not expecting a battle until 2 days later, if all went as expected, then around 90% of the French army should be able to arrive and take some part in the battle on the Tuesday. The problem was that Napoleon's estimation was wrong, as the force before him was not the main Prussian army, but merely a strong flank and rear guard, for the Prussians had already begun their retreat, and rather than falling on the rear of a pinned enemy, Napoleon's enveloping force was about to walk headfirst into the main Prussian army. The question was, would it be Davout alone facing this threat, or would he have support from Marshal Bernadotte? Although written at 10 p.m. on Monday night, these orders didn't arrive in Davout's hands at Naumburg until 3 a.m. on Tuesday morning, and, after reading them, he immediately rode to show Bernadotte their contents. Once again, Bernadotte had received no direct orders of his own, but at least this time Davout's orders certainly did make reference to him, and so the two marshals held a discussion about which course of action to take. With Bernadotte still in the vicinity of Naumburg, the possibility of the two corps marching together was seemingly discussed, but ultimately Bernadotte appeared to feel that these new orders stressed how important it was for him to be at Dornberg, and therefore he set off immediately for that location, whilst Davout chose to cross the Saale at Colson and proceed to Apolda via Auerstadt. Not long after he departed, Davout's vanguard became engaged with Prussians, and what began as a small skirmish quickly escalated into a full-blown engagement, and Davout found himself hard-pressed against superior numbers. But, with equal measures of fortune, bravery and skill, the various elements of his Third Corps were able to halt the ill-coordinated Prussian attacks, and then even begin to push the Prussians back. It was a brilliant action by Davout and his men, who had found themselves faced with nearly 60,000 Prussians, yet they managed to rout much of this force by the end of an exhausting day. However, how had this happened? How had one single French corps been exposed to action with the majority of the Prussian army, and yet no help had materialized? Where was the rest of La Grande Armée? Upon arriving at Jena on Monday afternoon, Napoleon had scouted the enemy force in position there, and agreed with Lannes' assessment that it consisted of at least 40,000 men. However, whilst this assumption was correct, he then incorrectly went on to believe that this was part of a much larger force, and therefore felt that he could face and defeat that on the morrow. The idea that the Prussians were already retreating, and that this was merely a very strong flank guard, did not appear to cross the Emperor's mind. Even still, he conducted the battle with his usual skill, but in victory he still believed that he had beaten the main Prussian army, and it was not until Davout's report of the action at Auerstadt arrived that he began to question that fact. He even initially disbelieved the accuracy of Davout's report, but upon accepting the truth he praised the Marshal and his corps for their unbelievable performance. With these two battles taking place, where was Bernadotte throughout all of this? You will recall that he had refused the idea of marching with Davout, and instead had chosen to march upon Dornburg, the location which his last official orders had designated. He therefore spent the day marching, passing through Cambourg before continuing to Dornburg, where he arrived around midday. Finding no enemy, though presumably hearing separate cannonades to his left and right, Bernadotte seemed to recall that Davout's orders made mention of a polder, and he therefore directed his corps towards that location. The Marshal rode forward with his vanguard and arrived towards 4 p.m, where he immediately captured 200 prisoners who had been trying to flee from the battle at Jena. He then remained at Polder throughout the night, allowing his corps to catch up and also bagging another 1,000 prisoners in the process. Upon his arrival he wrote the following report. I have the honour to inform your Majesty that I have arrived at Apolda. Hearing a cannonade on my right, and presuming that Marshal Davout was engaged with the enemy, I hurried forward with only 1 division, my light cavalry, and 3 regiments of dragoons. The bad roads and almost impassable defiles which we met on the Dornburg route greatly impeded my march. The breakdown of several ammunition wagons also caused much loss of time. I shall wait for the troops which I left behind. As soon as they arrive, I shall continue my march to Weimar, unless I receive orders to the contrary. Marshal Davout is still a long way from Apolda. I shall communicate with him. Some of the enemy's troops are to be seen on the heights of Apolda. Barton also notes the following. Bernadotte also sent an officer to the Emperor complaining of the failure of the staff to send him direct orders. On the following morning he was the recipient of dispatches instructing him to pursue the Prussians energetically with carte blanche to do them as much harm as possible. Bernadotte was clearly, and with some justification, frustrated at his lack of clear and direct orders, and felt that he had acted upon those which he did have with satisfaction. However, 2 battles had been fought, and Bernadotte's corps had spent the day marching between them and without firing a shot. Clearly something had misfired in the French system. Having finally received his own set of direct orders on the morning after the battles, Bernadotte carried them out with zeal, and together with Soult's 4th Corps and Murat's reserve cavalry, these 3 marshals undertook one of the most relentless pursuits of the entire period, within 3 weeks capturing around 100,000 more Prussian soldiers. Bernadotte and his 1st Corps were to also somewhat redeem their lack of action at either battle, with a brilliant and daring storming of the fortress town of Halle 3 days later, despite the numerical odds being against them. Even Napoleon was impressed by such an action. Bernadotte stops at nothing. Some day that Gascon will get caught. Despite this, as well as the prominent role that he played in the pursuit, his conduct and apparent inaction during the battles of Jena and Auerstadt had been noted by Napoleon, though no mention of it nor any accusations were immediately thrown towards Bernadotte. A week passed before any charge was made against Bernadotte from headquarters. On the 20th he was ordered to throw a bridge over the Elbe at Barbie, or at the mouth of the Saale. On the 21st a letter was written by Berthier blaming him for not having carried out the order, which General Dupont declared to have been absolutely impossible in the time. This censure was a mere peg upon which to hang a larger accusation. This larger accusation was one of disobeying orders and risking the safety of the army, and was of course in reference to his failure to either support Davout Auerstadt or to join in and attack the Prussian left flank at Jena. Here is the relevant extract from Berthier's letter. His Majesty, who is much annoyed at your failure to execute his orders, reminds you in this connection that you were not present at the Battle of Jena, that your absence might have imperiled the fate of the army, and that it rendered the battle less decisive and more sanguinary than it might have been. Deeply distressed although the Emperor was, he refrained from referring to that matter, because his recollection of your previous services and his personal regard for you induced him to keep silence. But as you have not gone to Kalb, or made any attempt to cross the Elbe either at Barbie or at the mouth of the Saal, the Emperor has decided to let you know his mind, as he is not accustomed to see his military operations sacrificed to vain questions of the etiquette of command. Upon receipt of such accusations, Marshal Bernadotte felt compelled to immediately reply and defend his case. It is not my fault, Duke, that I did not take a great part in the affair of Jena. I wrote to you at the time explaining to you the obstacles which obstructed my march on the eve of the battle. It was only 3 o'clock in the morning when I was informed of the contents of your letter addressed to Marshal Davout, in which it was stated that the Emperor attached great importance to my being at Dornburg. I started without losing an instant. I marched with all possible haste and reached Dornburg at 11 o'clock. I would have even then been in time to fulfill His Majesty's wishes if the defile of Dornburg, the character of which all the world is aware of, had not lost me infinite time. In spite of these difficulties, I marched with 1 division of my cavalry, and arrived at Apolda at 4 o'clock, in time to cause the retreat of the enemy who were engaged with Marshal Davout, and I took 5 guns and more than 1,000 prisoners, including a whole battalion. I repeat, Duke, I could not possibly have done more. I did all that was humanly possible. It is very painful to me to have to descend into these details. I am convinced that I did my duty. No greater misfortune could befall me than to displease the Emperor. I should be inconsolable if I had not the utmost confidence in his sense of justice. It would seem that Bernadotte also sent a copy of this letter to Napoleon, who dictated a response 2 days later. I have received your letter. It is not my custom to indulge in recrimination over the irredeemable past. Your army corps were absent from the field of battle, and its absence might have had disastrous consequences. In obedience to a very precise order, you ought to have been at Dornburg, one of the principal passes of the Saal, on the same day that Marshal Lannes was at Jena, Marshal Augereau at Cal, and Marshal Davout at Naumburg. I let you know in the night that if you had not carried out that movement, and if you were still at Naumburg, you were to march after Marshal Davout and support him. You were at Naumburg when that order arrived, and it was communicated to you. Nevertheless, you chose to make a useless march back to Dornburg, and consequently you were absent from the battle, and Marshal Davout sustained the main attack of the enemy. Certainly this is all very unfortunate. Circumstances had in the meantime given you the opportunity of proving your zeal. Other opportunities will present themselves for demonstrating your talents and your attachment to my person. It seems then that Napoleon viewed Bernadotte's conduct and infractions as extremely serious, and in his memoirs on St. Helena he stated that he actually wrote out the order for Bernadotte's trial by court-martial, but after a change of heart he tore it up. The question is, why did he tear it up? But before we can speculate that, we must first determine whether or not Bernadotte was guilty of the crimes he is being accused of. The first place to start is in addressing the most serious of the allegations, that Marshal Bernadotte deliberately disobeyed direct orders, and by refusing to march with Marshal Davout, he exposed the Marshal and his corps to bear the brunt of the Prussian army alone, an action by which, although successful, nonetheless saw Third Corps take excessive casualties. Napoleon in his letter accuses Bernadotte of this in the following terms. I let you know in the night that if you had not carried out that movement, and if you were still at Naumburg, you were to march after Marshal Davout and support him. You were at Naumburg when that order arrived, and it was communicated to you. Nevertheless, you chose to make a useless march back to Dornburg, and consequently you were absent from the battle, and Marshal Davout sustained the main attack of the enemy. Napoleon here gives the impression that the orders for Bernadotte were clear and that the Marshal disobeyed them, and instead chose to revert to earlier orders. But was this actually the case? If we take a look at the order again, 3 things are clear. The first is that the order is for Davout, and not Bernadotte, although it certainly does make strong and frequent mention of him. As a quick side note, although I never came across this myself, Petra states that several defenders of Bernadotte claim that he never actually saw this order, and therefore the reason he marched to Dornburg was simply because he was working from the only orders that he had. This notion can be immediately dismissed by the following line in Bernadotte's own letter to Berthier. Clearly he saw the letter, and Davout himself in his own writing states that he rode to Bernadotte's headquarters, where the two of them discussed the contents of the order. Therefore Bernadotte was clearly aware of the contents of this order written for Davout. In returning to the order, the second point that is clearly emphasized is the hope from Napoleon that Bernadotte and the troops under his command were already in position at Dornburg. It is clearly stressed multiple times, and it is easy to understand why Bernadotte, upon reading this, would feel that it was vital that he therefore head for Dornburg as quickly as possible. The reason why Napoleon desired Bernadotte to be at Dornburg was because he was absolutely convinced that the main Prussian army was about to fight him at Jena the next morning, and the idea would be for Bernadotte to fall upon the flank of this force, whilst Davout fell upon its rear. Therefore we can turn to the crucial part of the letter and the centre of this entire myth. The line reads, "If Marshal Bernadotte should be with you, you might march together." This can be broken in two. The first half, "if Marshal Bernadotte should be with you," can be answered by confirming that yes, Bernadotte was at, or close enough to Naumburg to be considered with Marshal Davout. Therefore the second part comes into play. You might march together. The word might, which is sometimes translated as could or may, is the key word here and is absolutely not a direct command. It leaves the choice of decision for both Davout and Bernadotte to discuss, which they did, with Bernadotte feeling that, given how strongly it was stressed that Napoleon hopes he is at Dornburg, that it would be best if he marched upon that place without delay. Therefore Napoleon in his letter to Bernadotte is wrong to suggest that he gave the Marshal direct orders telling him to march with Davout, and it is entirely unfair to accuse Bernadotte of disobeying such an order. Unfortunately, many of the memoir writers after the Napoleonic Wars began to echo Napoleon's accusations, and Bernadotte's decision to leave France to become a Swedish prince probably didn't help his cause in these matters, but that should not have influenced the truth, which is that Bernadotte did not disobey direct orders in his decision to march away from Davout. In fact, the last set of direct orders for Bernadotte had come on the previous day, which were addressed to Murat, but this time clearly gave direction to Bernadotte's corps, which was to march upon Dornburg, which is what he did. Therefore it is a shame that too many historians also choose to falsely accuse Bernadotte of such things. The historian Maud offers an interesting take as to the reasons why this order was so ambiguous in its language, suggesting that the choice of the word might, as opposed to something more direct such as should, was deliberate. It would seem that it was now that there first crept into the French staff the habit of deliberately framing orders capable of being interpreted in several ways. In order to cover their own responsibilities, orders were framed admitting of two or more interpretations. If the recipient chose the right one, the staff congratulated itself on its perspicacity. If, on the other hand, events proved the recipient wrong in his action, they pointed to the order and said, "Why, of course that was not what the order meant. Any fool could have seen that." This is actually quite a serious allegation, essentially suggesting that the French staff were willing to risk sabotaging operations for the sake of their own reputation. But could this have really been the case? Firstly, it should be pointed out that almost all orders were initially dictated in one form or another by Napoleon, and as I highlighted in a previous video, he also very often oversaw their writing and added small changes before they were sent out. Napoleon's secretary had the following to say about the inner workings of imperial headquarters. Berthier, Talleyrand, and many others did not give an order or write a dispatch which had not been dictated by Napoleon. He took not only the initiative in thought, but also attended personally to the details of every piece of business. I do not contend that he was quite justified in thus wishing to do everything himself, but his genius, superhuman in its activity, carried him away. He felt he possessed the means and the time to manage everything. In reality, it was he who did everything. Therefore, the accusation is not that the staff would sabotage orders, but that Napoleon himself would risk his operations for the sake of preserving his reputation. For sake of space, I don't want to get too deep into this with lots of quotes and research, and will instead just offer my opinion here, but hopefully the remainder of this video will shed some light onto Napoleon's character to support my opinions here anyway. Essentially then, the first question should be, was Napoleon capable of doing such things? And the answer is yes, he certainly was. He was smart enough to understand how to manipulate situations and people for his own benefit. Therefore, it is certainly possible that he might do such a thing. However, the next question is, would he do such a thing? And I think, especially in this instance, the answer is a resounding no. This is 1806, La Grande Armée and Napoleon are at the peak of their powers, and Europe is at their feet, morale and confidence is sky high, and Napoleon's reputation is built upon his military success. Therefore it seems absurd that he would risk his operations for the sake of preserving this reputation. The idea itself is contradictory when viewed in these terms. Besides, I think it is important to try and put oneself into the shoes of both Napoleon and the staff at the time when this order to Davout containing the vague and fateful line was written. It is dated at 10 PM on Monday the 13th, the night before the two battles. Napoleon had been working all day at this point, frantically unsure as to whether Lannes was about to be attacked, and upon arriving at Jena he conducted a close reconnaissance of the Prussian lines, before then setting out his battle plans for the following day. Just prior to dictating these orders, he had actually just returned from a second reconnaissance with General Suchet, and upon his return had been fired upon by a French sentry who mistook him for a Prussian. Then it should be remembered that Napoleon and his staff had to consider the movements and operations of not just Bernadotte's corps, but of 5 other army corps, the Reserve Cavalry, Reserve Artillery, the Imperial Guard, a Bavarian army corps, as well as supplies, and to all of that is added a consideration of the intentions of the enemy. To believe that during all of this, Napoleon or the staff were also purposefully wording orders in such ways as to be potentially misleading and accounting for multiple possibilities, all in order to protect reputations, a practice which could also jeopardize operations, to me at least seems absurd. I will freely admit that I consider Napoleon a genius. He had a marvellous mind, but I don't think that even he is clever enough to purposely word an order meant for Davout, but which included a vague half-order or recommendation for Bernadotte, also that he might have an excuse and someone to blame should things go wrong. Plus, in this particular incident, the ambiguity in such an order can in many ways be excused. It must always be remembered that communication during this period was primarily achieved through written or verbal orders, carried between units by horsemen, who could, depending upon the distance, take several hours to reach their destination. This meant that conflicting reports could and often did cross paths, and such delays in communication might then cause confusion for both a commander and his subordinates. Bernadotte had received orders via Murat to march with his corps to Dornburg. He wrote to Berthier at 6 PM confirming his receipt of these and stating that he was going to perform a night march to Dornburg. Then, 2 hours later, he wrote a second letter saying that he had now stopped and was therefore still around Naumburg. To add to this, Murat, once he arrived at Imperial headquarters at some point towards the evening, would most likely have informed Napoleon and the staff that he had left Bernadotte in charge of his reserve cavalry with orders to march to Dornburg. Therefore, in all likelihood, Napoleon and Imperial headquarters, when drafting the orders at 10 PM, had no real idea as to Bernadotte's exact location, and when you reread the order to Davout with all of the above in mind, its language and style makes a lot more sense. They hoped that Bernadotte was at Dornburg, but if he was still at Naumburg, then you may march with Davout. Could this have all been solved with a direct order to Bernadotte? Yes, probably. But again, they aren't just dealing with Bernadotte, but with an entire army, and they are on the verge of a potentially major battle. These things get missed, unfortunately. It is certainly poor staff work, but this happens in war, especially on the eve of battle when the chaos gets turned up to 11. Why then, if Napoleon was the one that dictated the order and was therefore keenly aware of its ambiguity, did he later blame Bernadotte and accuse him of disobedience? The answer is simply that Napoleon knew that much of this was in fact his fault and his alone. If Bernadotte had simply adhered to his initial orders and not stopped during the night, then he would have been at Dornburg when Davout received his latter orders, and the line, "If Bernadotte is with you at Naumburg, then you may march together," would have been nothing more than a minor footnote in history. In that case, Davout would still have acted as he did and marched alone, and would therefore still have ran into the main Prussian army at Auerstadt entirely alone. In Napoleon's mind, even during the Battle of Jena, the Prussian army was either on the plains before him, or else on the road from Erfurt. The idea that they had already commenced their retreat never entered his mind, and he therefore had no visions of Davout having to face anything other than a rear or flank guard, which he would be expected to easily brush aside before joining the main battle. Hence the line in his orders, "The important thing is that you should take part in the battle." Therefore, the risk to Davout's corps was entirely the fault of the Emperor, for if all orders had been adhered to properly, then whilst Bernadotte may have played a role at Jena, Davout would still have been exposed and isolated. Napoleon's error was a miscalculation, and he can and should be criticised for doing so. Although the corps were designed to be able to fight holding actions independently until support arrived, Davout was completely exposed by the Emperor's movement orders, and his 23,000 men should have been defeated and given a severe beating by the 55,000 Prussians before any help could have arrived. The fact that he not only wasn't drubbed, but that he managed to score a victory and even push the Prussians back, is equal parts credit to Davout's handling of his corps, the performance of his men, and the disorganized handling of the Prussians. However, the victory at Auerstadt does not excuse Napoleon's ignorance in misreading the enemy and exposing part of his army. To briefly offer a defence for Napoleon, it is of course a simple matter sitting here with hindsight, good maps, and a clear knowledge of the position of both armies to play armchair historian. Napoleon was having to figure out the enemy's plans based on reports, rumours, sightings, prisoner interrogation, and his own imagination. However, it cannot be denied that in this instance he was certainly wrong, simple as that. But that is the thing, I still consider Napoleon a genius, especially in military matters, and therefore I think that he would have been keenly aware of his errors here once the situation became clearer. He would have known that it was he who was at fault, but admitting that was extremely risky for his reputation. Napoleon was fully aware that his throne, his position in Europe, and his popularity with the French people was based largely upon his military reputation. This reputation must, therefore, be guarded and enhanced. France must believe that only the Emperor could win great victories and bring glory to the continent. It should be stated here that another unfortunate myth is that Napoleon, to protect his reputation, refused to acknowledge the achievements of Davout at Auerstadt. But that simply isn't true. He was genuine and open with his praise for both the Marshal and his men. "My cousin, I send you my compliments with all my heart on your fine conduct. I regret the loss of your brave men, but they have died on the field of honour. Extend to all of your corps and your generals my satisfaction. They have acquired an everlasting right to my esteem and recognition." Marshal Davout has had a superb affair. He alone has battled 60,000 Prussians. He has fought the entire day and has put to flight more than 60,000 men commanded by Mollendorf, Kalreuth, and the king in person. This army corps has covered itself with glory. Napoleon also gave Third Corps the privilege of being the first French troops to march through Berlin, and in the inspection that he gave the troops a few days later, he was once again full of praise for the men and their officers. He even later awarded Davout with the title Duc d'Auerstadt in recognition of the battle. But, if Napoleon was fine with admitting that Davout had done so well, how then did he protect his reputation and not allow Davout's victory to eclipse his own? He did this in two rather sneaky ways. The first was to claim that Jena and Auerstadt were in fact one single battle, of which Davout was acting as the right wing and still therefore under Napoleon's control and direction. This allowed him to claim partial credit for Davout's success, and he could tie it into his own, admittedly still impressive, victory at Jena through the bulletins and in the subsequent history of events. Even now it is sometimes referred to as the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt, when in fact they are absolutely two entirely separate battles. However, even if this was accepted to be one single battle, there is still a question of why did Napoleon allow his right wing to be exposed to the majority of the Prussian army. Thankfully, to avoid this particular criticism, Napoleon had been gifted the perfect scapegoat, Marshal Bernadotte. When Napoleon found that he was being criticised for having left Davout unsupported at Auerstadt, he took advantage of Bernadotte's absence from the battle and made the specious accusation that Bernadotte had disobeyed an order to support Davout on that occasion. As we have discussed above, the line referring to Bernadotte marching with Davout was at best a recommendation, but in no way could it ever be seen as a direct order. Even Marshal Davout, the real aggrieved party here, didn't blame Bernadotte for not marching with him, nor ever accuse him of defying direct orders. Davout himself, despite the fact that his hatred of Bernadotte stemmed from this day, did not criticise the actions of his comrade in arms, either in his official correspondence, his Opération du 13e Corps, or in his private correspondence. Whilst it is true that the First Corps could clearly hear the guns of Auerstadt, its commander had received no orders from the Emperor to support Davout. Despite this, many memoir writers, and by consequence many historians, have accepted Napoleon's version of events, and the common narrative persists that Bernadotte defied orders and was the reason that Davout was exposed, when in reality it was Napoleon who was to blame for almost all of it. Does this therefore mean that Bernadotte is completely innocent in all of this? Well, not exactly, as there can be more charges thrown his way than simply disobeying orders. As the previous quote alludes to, even though Davout never accused Bernadotte of defying orders, he still came to hate him for his conduct during these events, and arguably for good reason, so let's assess Bernadotte's actions over these few days. The first accusation is the suggestion that Bernadotte purposefully moved slowly, ignoring the cannonades and taking his time, the result being that his corps failed to have impact on either battlefield, despite spending much of the day between the two. Unfortunately for his reputation, he did not act with anything approaching energy, but carried out his march so tardily that he failed to reach either field in time to render assistance. You may recall earlier in his letter to Berthier, Bernadotte tackled this charge of lethargy by calling to the nature of the terrain. I would have even been there in time to fulfill His Majesty's wishes if the defile of Dornburg, the character of which all the world is aware of, had not lost me infinite time. Biographers of Bernadotte also take the same view, noting the difficulty of the passes both to and from Dornburg, but historians of the campaign tend to take a different view and disagree with Bernadotte's assessment of the terrain. Looking from the Saale up the valley leading from Dornburg to the plateau, there seem few difficulties, certainly none such as Soult had in the Rauthal. Besides, we know that Hohenlohe on the evening of the 13th went down to Dornburg with a brigade and up again all in a few hours, apparently without any difficulty. His march was conducted with such slowness that he only reached that spot at 4 p.m, having taken nearly 6 hours to cover 8 miles, and nothing in the nature of the defiles to be overcome exists or existed to justify this delay. Personally, I'm not sure what to think here, as I've never seen the ground over which he marched, and so perhaps the final word on this matter is best given to General Dupont, who was one of Bernadotte's divisional commanders. Although still open to a critique of possible bias towards his senior commander here, Dupont had proven his willingness to fight and to march to support his colleagues during the Ulm and Austerlitz campaigns the previous year, and would do so again the following year at Friedland, acting upon his own initiative to support Marshal Ney's stalling advance. Essentially, I'm suggesting that it would be difficult to describe him as a lazy officer looking to avoid action, and therefore here is his description of the terrain around Dornburg. The road which leads to it is very narrow. It is made in the rock of a steep mountain sloping towards the river. The ascent on the other side is still more difficult, being very much longer and steeper. Badly cut rocks in some places obstruct the road. The teams of the transport wagons and of the artillery carriages had to be doubled and even trebled. Some wagons broke down, which increased the disorder. In a word, if it had not been accomplished, it would be difficult to believe that artillery could ever have crossed such a pass. The next charge to be laid at Bernadotte is that, upon hearing the cannons thundering at Auerstadt, he should have marched to the sound of the guns, or at the very least detached a division as well as some cavalry to support Marshal Davout's isolated corps. It is usually suggested that this could have been achieved at Cambourg, and that Davout actually sent an ADC to Bernadotte requesting such support. The problem with this view is summarised well by Barton. Whether Davout sent an officer to Bernadotte is a moot point. It has been pointed out that no satisfactory document exists to show that he did so. Davout does not mention it in the journal of his corps, and the report of his aide-de-camp, Trobriand, which is the only authority on the subject, was not published until 73 years after the event, and contains internal evidence of its untrustworthiness. This is another difficult point to form a firm conclusion upon in my opinion, because much of the supposed evidence is simply hearsay. The nature of the battle at Auerstadt was one of an encounter battle, whereby the armies were not all present at the start of the engagement, but each side got drawn into it as the day wore on. Therefore Davout would not have initially been aware that he was facing such a large force, and may perhaps have felt no need to call for help. Plus, although it is never mentioned, I often wonder if Bernadotte could also hear the guns at Jena to his south, and if so, and given Napoleon's orders, it may have made more sense to Bernadotte to move his forces towards that engagement instead. Remember, Napoleon's letters and orders gave the impression that the main battle would occur at Jena or Weimar, and therefore it would be understandable if Bernadotte presumed that Davout was merely facing an advance guard, which he should brush aside with ease. If Bernadotte had marched to his aid for an unnecessary smaller engagement, and thus denied Napoleon vital support in the supposed main battle, then he would have been in trouble, and it is easy to see why he would choose not to do so. Again, these situations are very easy to form opinions on what was right or wrong when looking back with the benefit of hindsight, but in the moment I can only imagine that the decisions were much less clear-cut, and so in my opinion, without firm evidence, judgment should be withheld. However, Davout's annoyance with Bernadotte was not just rooted in the lack of support, but it also seemingly stemmed from the manner of the meeting between the two marshals, where they discussed the orders and decided whether to march together or separately. As mentioned above, Davout never viewed Bernadotte as having disobeyed orders in his decision to march upon Dornburg, but it does seem that he was frustrated with Bernadotte's refusal to march with him, or at least the manner of this refusal. Unfortunately, we of course will never know the full content of their conversation, but the sources do offer us a small glimpse into its nature, and potentially reveal something of Bernadotte's character. Napoleon at St. Helena, in his notes on the memoirs of Bernadotte, says that Marshal demanded to lead the way if he marched with Davout. The latter objected that, Bernadotte's corps being in rear of him, it would cause confusion if it passed to the front. Bernadotte insisted on having precedence, on the ground that his corps was number 1, whilst Davout's was number 3. Essentially, what is being insinuated here is that Bernadotte agreed to march with Davout, but only if his corps could lead the way. His reasoning was twofold. Firstly, his corps was numbered 1, whereas Davout's was numbered 3, and military protocol stated that junior regiments gave way to more senior ones. Incidentally, if you look at Napoleon's initial formation upon entering Saxony, the 3 columns of his army each has the senior regiment to the fore. The second reason plays a little more into the realms of ego, for when marching, the trailing corps would obviously be subject to the movements of the one in front of it, and by necessity then under the command of the leading general. This is what had taken place in the earlier stages of the campaign, with Bernadotte and his corps subservient to Murat's command. However, Bernadotte didn't object to this because Murat was senior to him on the list of marshals, but the problem with allowing Davout to lead, and therefore command him, was that he was lower on the list, and therefore his junior. While standard military practice would agree with Bernadotte that the senior officer should be in command, the problem here was that Davout's 3rd Corps was already on the Western Road, and it would therefore have to move aside and wait for 1st Corps to pass through Naumburg and overtake them. Seemingly this waste of time was exactly what Davout pointed out, and at least according to Napoleon was what Bernadotte refused to accept, and led to him marching to Dornburg instead. Given how petty all of this seems, some defenders of Bernadotte dismiss this as a mere excuse crafted in the mind of Napoleon to further obscure the truth, but there is actually some evidence to suggest that Bernadotte may indeed have acted in this manner. If you recall the letter which Berthier sent to Bernadotte a week after these events, the one that first chastised him for his behaviour, the final line reads thus: "The Emperor has decided to let you know his mind, as he is not accustomed to see his military operations sacrificed to the vain questions of the etiquette of command." Was this etiquette of command referring to this conversation of who should be in the lead? It certainly does seem so, and interestingly, Marshal Bernadotte never actually refuted this accusation in his reply to the charges thrown at him. He also further damaged his cause in this instance with his reply to his friend Bourrienne when asked about his actions a month later, on November the 10th. I might have felt piqued at receiving something like orders from Davout, but I did my duty. This is clearly not the attitude you would want from someone supposed to be cooperating with a fellow marshal, but of course, not being present for the conversation, we can't ever know how it exactly took place. Davout, for instance, may have been unpleasant or demanding in his wish for Bernadotte to march with him, hence the nature of Bernadotte's comment here. Therefore, this will have to remain hearsay, but it certainly doesn't look good. However, it is to the second part of that reply to Bourrienne to which I think the most valid criticism can be laid at Bernadotte, his belief that he did his duty. As I have stated many times at this point, he certainly didn't disobey any direct orders in any of his actions, especially not in choosing to march to Dornburg, but I don't think he can accurately claim to have done his duty, nor can he use the excuse that he was simply following orders. The reason I say this is because, to use the excuse, I was just following orders, then you have to actually follow the orders to the letter and not interpret certain parts or choose to ignore others, something which Bernadotte is certainly guilty of here. In the first instance, we return to 3 p.m. on the Monday, the day before the battles, where Murat received the following letter from Napoleon. At last the veil is drawn aside, the enemy is beginning to retreat on Magdeburg. Go as quickly as possible with Bernadotte's corps to Dornburg, a large village situated between Jena and Naumburg. Go there yourself with your dragoons and cavalry. I think the enemy will either try to attack Marshal Lannes at Jena, or will slip away. If they attack Marshal Lannes, your position at Dornburg will enable you to help him. If nothing new happens, come to me yourself tonight to Jena. Murat chose to ride immediately to Imperial headquarters, instructing and trusting Bernadotte to lead both his cavalry as well as his own corps to Dornburg in concordance with these orders from Napoleon. To me, the entire tone of this letter is one of haste and urgency, especially in the line, go as quickly as possible with Bernadotte's corps to Dornburg, before then detailing how he fears that Marshal Lannes may be attacked, and it is from Dornburg that they may support Lannes in case of that eventuality. Therefore it is quite clear that Bernadotte was to march to Dornburg as soon as possible. The problem is that Bernadotte didn't set off straight away. He waited a further 3.5 hours before doing so. We know this because he penned the following letter to Berthier detailing his intentions dated 6 p.m. Although my troops are very tired and have not had their meal, I shall start in half an hour, and I shall reach Camburg before midnight. I shall then give my troops a short rest, and shall be at Dornburg before daylight tomorrow, ready to proceed to Weimar or anywhere else. My cavalry will be at Dornburg tonight. Here, Bernadotte claims the reason for the delay was that his troops were tired, and if you recall, Napoleon initially intended the corps to spend the Monday resting, so it is not completely without justification. The problem is that when you consult the marching distances as given by Maud, you can see that Bernadotte's troops had marched similar distances to all of the other corps, all of whom would manage to force march their way into taking some part in either of the battles the following day. Bernadotte could claim that his corps had fought an engagement at Schliess, whilst most other corps had yet to be engaged, but the problem with this argument is that Marshal Lannes' 5th Corps had fought 3 times by this point, and had still managed to march further than Bernadotte's corps, and would play a prominent role in the Battle of Jena the following day. Not all marching is equal, and the nature of terrain can make a difference, but allowing the men to rest was not in keeping with the spirit of Napoleon's orders in my opinion, and certainly pushes back on Bernadotte's claim that he was simply doing his duty. Napoleon, in his letter chastising Bernadotte, actually draws reference to this lethargy in the following line. In obedience to a very precise order, you ought to have been at Dornburg, one of the principal passes of the Saale, on the same day that Marshal Lannes was at Jena, Marshal Augereau at Cal, and Marshal Davout at Naumburg. Again, I find it difficult to agree with Napoleon that this was a precise order, as the words used were as quickly as possible, rather than something more specific such as be at Naumburg tonight. And as Bernadotte did technically eventually get to Naumburg, I find it difficult to view him as disobeying a direct order, as insinuated by Napoleon. Nevertheless, his actions were certainly not in keeping with the clear implication of haste within the order, and so he should be criticised for that. But worse, I feel, came later that same evening. Not long after finally setting off towards Dornburg, Marshal Davout arrived to share with him the following orders that he had just received from Napoleon. The Emperor, Monsieur le Maréchal, learns, 1 league from Jena, that the enemy is face to face with Marshal Lannes with nearly 50,000 men. The Marshal even believes that he will be attacked this evening. If, this evening, you hear an attack at Jena, you must manoeuvre on the enemy and outflank its left. If there is no attack this evening at Jena, you will receive the dispositions for tomorrow. As you can see, this letter makes absolutely no mention of Marshal Bernadotte, yet, upon reading it, he decided that it would be best if he now halted his men, and he therefore penned a second letter to Berthier informing him of the new situation. Marshal Davout has just communicated to me, Duke, your letter of him today. In view of its contents, I thought it my duty to stop the contemplated movement of which I informed you in my letter of 6 p.m. this evening, because you order Marshal Davout to manoeuvre on the enemy's left wing in the event of Marshal Lannes being attacked tonight in the neighbourhood of Jena, and you add that, if the attack does not take place, he will receive further orders from the Emperor tomorrow. As I presume that those will be general orders, I am halting my troops where they are, and I await further commands. I am still with my whole corps in the neighbourhood of Naumburg. I am ready to execute whatever orders the Emperor shall send me. Again, I don't think that Bernadotte can honestly say that he was simply following orders and doing his duty when, clearly without orders, he chose to halt his men, under the presumption that he would receive fresh instructions in the morning. He of course wouldn't receive any orders, which was bad practice by Napoleon and Imperial headquarters, but if Bernadotte had simply acted upon the orders he did have, and marched to Dornburg with all haste, then none of this controversy would have occurred. Although it is often implied that Marshal Bernadotte was responsible for Marshal Davout having to face odds of 2-1 at the Battle of Auerstadt, hopefully this video has shown that the responsibility for that mishap lay entirely at the feet of Napoleon, whose misinterpretation and false analysis of the Prussian positions and intentions nearly cost him his Third Corps. The fact that Davout was able to come out victorious from the engagement is in credit to him and his men, but it does not excuse Napoleon's mistake. However, given that a large proportion of Napoleon's reputation and power was based upon his military reputation, he sought to obscure his errors in 2 ways. Firstly, he claimed that the battles of Jena and Auerstadt were actually a single, much larger battle, one which he had foreseen and accounted for in all his calculations. This we have shown not to be the case, and as the historian Vichet nicely summarises. May we be permitted to say that on the morning of October the 14th, 1806, Napoleon in no way thought of a battle with a front of 20 kilometres. He saw only the battle before Jena, with a front of 5 kilometres. If he had thought of a battle with a front of 20 kilometres, it is very probable that he would have conducted it otherwise. Secondly, Bernadotte's inaction during both battles enabled Napoleon to explain away Davout's exposure by claiming that he gave Bernadotte strict orders to march with him, but which the latter refused to obey. Again, hopefully this video has shown that any such reference to marching with Davout was at best no more than a recommendation, and in no way a direct order. Accusing Bernadotte of this was unjust, and it is a shame that so many historians over the years have taken Napoleon's viewpoint on this as gospel and thus condemned Bernadotte. Fortunately, not all of them are guilty of this, and Barton summarises the truth regarding Napoleon in this situation rather well. If he had told the truth, he would have admitted that he was ignorant of the position of the main Prussian army, and that he had no idea that Davout would meet it. He preferred to declare that he had foreseen and provided for the event by ordering Bernadotte to march with Davout and to support him, and that Bernadotte, for some technical reason of precedence or priority, had disobeyed this order and had marched in another direction to Cambourg and Dornburg. Whilst he may not have disobeyed any orders, Bernadotte's behaviour over this period was not of the highest calibre, and if, as it certainly does appear, he refused to march with Davout due to reasons of military etiquette, then it was certainly petty. Besides this, Bernadotte's decision to seemingly interpret different orders how and when he saw fit certainly opens him to some valid criticism, and even if he should be exonerated of accusations of treachery and disobedience, he is certainly, in my opinion, guilty of acting unprofessionally. There is, though, one more minor detail to discuss before we finish, and that is the possible reason why Napoleon, after initially signing the order for Bernadotte's court-martial, then tore it up and in essence never really punished the marshal for what he was accusing him of. Almost all of this is speculation, for although Napoleon did give his thoughts, I'm not sure that I personally trust them given the circumstances. It is generally agreed that, had Napoleon gone through with the military trial, then in all likelihood Bernadotte would have been found guilty and probably then executed by firing squad. According to General Savary, Napoleon certainly believed this to be the case. That is so hateful that if I send him to a court-martial, it is equivalent to ordering him to be shot. It is better for me not to speak about it. Given that proving Bernadotte's innocence in these matters would have meant exposing the truth and thus damaging Napoleon's reputation, it seems unlikely that he would have been given a fair trial, and he probably would therefore have been found guilty. The trial never took place, and the usual reason given for Napoleon's clemency in this matter is that Bernadotte was married to Desiree Clary, who had been Napoleon's first love, and whom he wished to marry prior to his meeting Josephine. Napoleon in his memoirs on St. Helena makes reference to this point. That Bernadotte became a Marshal of France, Prince of Pontecorvo, and at length a king, it is to this marriage that he is indebted. All Bernadotte's errors and foolish actions during the imperial reign were constantly pardoned on account of this marriage. This is certainly plausible, and it may have been at least a partial factor in his decision, but we only have Napoleon's word for this being the case, and I'd argue that given what was at stake, his word cannot totally be trusted here. I am instead going to suggest a possible different reason for his reluctance to punish Bernadotte. Napoleon was undoubtedly a military genius, and I think that he of all people, upon seeing the facts after the two battles, would have realised that he had seriously misjudged the situation, unwittingly exposed a portion of his army, and was heavily indebted to Davout for defeating the main Prussian force. As we have discussed, although he could and did praise Davout, he couldn't admit that he had been wrong, for his reputation was reliant upon his military success. He therefore had to conceal the truth and maintain this reputation. He did this by claiming the battles as won, and then by using Marshal Bernadotte as a scapegoat. However, I think that this is where Napoleon had to himself draw the line. Shifting the blame onto Bernadotte was one thing, but condemning him to death just to cover the emperor's own errors I think may have seemed too far. Again, Napoleon couldn't admit that this was the real reason for his clemency, because it would have meant admitting his errors, and so Bernadotte's marriage to Desiree Clary offered a reasonable and convenient excuse for his actions. It may seem that I am clutching at straws here, but it is also interesting that Napoleon never actually punished Bernadotte at all, except in writing, something which the historian Young noticed. It seems strange that Bernadotte was permitted to retain command of his corps. If Napoleon seriously felt that Bernadotte had done wrong, but he didn't want to condemn him via a military trial, then why not simply remove him from command, something which he would go on to do at the Battle of Wagram 3 years later? In my opinion, the difference then was that Bernadotte had actually made errors and was to blame, but at Jena and Auerstadt I think Napoleon recognised that the errors were his own, even if he wouldn't, or perhaps couldn't, admit it publicly. I accept that I may be completely wrong here, and this is pure speculation, which is why I left it until after the conclusion, but I would be interested to see what other people think about the situation and Napoleon's reasons for clemency. But, until next time, thanks for watching.